thanks very much for joining us here at COP26. It would be interesting to get your sense, I suppose, as the host city, on some of the influences and I suppose some of the opportunities, particularly for Glasgow as a city region.
One of the things I think that's been really clear about COP is that it's now we're moving into the space of delivery. So we've spent the last 5 years since Paris talking about what has to happen and kind of how do we make, and now the conversation is about the how. And so I think for Glasgow as a city, we also need to translate that through, right? So, you'll have heard about the 100 billion that needs to be mobilized into climate finance in the international context. Well, actually the same for us as a city. What we need to be doing now is translating those investment needs, into real projects on the ground. So things like our Glasgow Green Investment Prospectus that we've just been launching is really about that. It's about starting to say, not just what does we as a city council spend our money on, but how do we steward wider private capital into the projects and programs and activities that are going to transform our city, they're going to transform business, transform our communities, and deliver on that decade of action that we have to get to becoming a net zero and climate resilient city over the next decade.
And I suppose how important is partnership within that, not just I suppose with local and national government, but also private capital and I suppose as well the general community here in the city?
Yeah, it's incredibly important, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is around, as I say, the investment needs for Glasgow are estimated to be about 30 billion over the next decade. That obviously can't come from public grants and public funds on its own, although we have a role to play there too. So it has to be done in partnership with the private sector. I think the other thing that's really important though is that the way in which that we get that done isn't clear yet. So we've had those really big market signals from things like the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero here at COP, where Mark Carney's mobilised 135 trillion of assets. That's not real money, that's a market signal, but it's really, really important. But we don't have the solutions, and private investors don't have the solutions yet to get that money onto the ground and into where it needs to be. So, that partnership is going to be absolutely crucial, working collaboratively with the private sector to develop the right business models that allow us to mobilise the funds into mitigation and adaptation, as quickly as possible and at significant scale.
You've obviously been at a lot of the events over the 2 weeks at COP. What's your overall perspectives or some of the key takeaways from your side?
I think there's two stories that are really going on at COP. We've had citizens and civil society, quite rightly, I suppose, demanding much more action, because when you look at some of the analysis that's coming out about where we are in terms of warming, countries arrived here in Glasgow at 2.7 degrees of warming projected. Actually, the assessments that have been released over the kind of weeks with the kind of the different pledges that have been made, that's brought that down, and depending on how optimistic you are, it's between 1.8 degrees of warming and 2.4 degrees. And so, there's a lot of I suppose, caveats to that, but if implemented, that takes us really further forward. At the same time, though, civil society and the public are quite rightly angry about the fact that we haven't got to the goals of the Paris Agreement. We haven't got to the point where countries are put us on track to 1.5 degrees of warming around building our resilience to climate change and mobilising the finance. People forget that actually the Paris Agreement has 3 goals in it. One is around mitigation and cutting emissions, one's around building resilience, and the third is about mobilising financial flows in a way that's compatible with that climate resilience and low carbon development. So I think it's important to hold on to the huge amounts of progress that have been announced. It will make a real difference in the real economy, whether it comes to mobility or to infrastructure or energy or whatever. But actually at the same time to hold true to the fact that we need to do much, much more, and actually we're going to have to do that pretty soon in the next year or two to get to that place where we need to be with emissions halving over the next decade for the developed countries.
Really good to get your perspectives, Kit, on that. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks very much.